Brant Gardner at a fair conference long ago. And yeah, it was long ago. I think it was at Alta, I guess it was, or was it Alta? Second one, and I was just been very impressed. We'd like to welcome Brant Gardner as a speaker. Brant Gardner's academic background includes work towards a PhD in Mesoamerican ethnohistory in the State University of New York, Albany. He publishes works on Mesoamerica, and this is where it's nice where I can just cut the bio and say read it later, because I usually can't read the words he has in here because they're too complicated. Brant is a friend, and he's got some exceptional work out on the Book of Mormon, and I think you'll really enjoy his topic here, which is, the title is From the East to the West, the Problem of Directions in the Book of Mormon. So Brant Gardner.
Not too close, or closer? Closer the better. Okay, we're fine, Mr. Sound Man here. All right. See, and then I get it that close and I can't read the darn thing. Gets this thing in my eye. Do the best I can. We'll figure it out. We're going to have to kind of angle over this way a bit, so I see the paper. Okay. In 1965, John L. Sorenson published An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon. That book was the culmination of decades of work establishing a real-world setting that plausibly fit textual geography in the Book of Mormon. Sorenson's model places the Book of Mormon in a part of the region known as Mesoamerica, extending perhaps from a little south of modern Guatemala, somewhere north of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. In addition to his work on the geography, Sorenson took his correlation to the next step. He examined the relationship between the available historical and cultural information for that region and the descriptions and events in the Book of Mormon, and those correlations have been impressive and have led to a lot of productive investigation. In spite of the many reasons that recommend this model, there is one major problem with the correlation. Deanne G. Matheny, a lawyer with a PhD in anthropology from the University of Utah, explains, the most fundamental geographical problem associated with Sorenson's model has to do with issues of directionality. In order for his model to fit the geography of the Mesoamerica, one must assume that the Nephites had a system of directions with cardinal directions skewed 45 degrees or more off of the usually observed cardinals. In other words, the whole directional card must be shifted by more than 60 degrees to the west for this model to fit the geography of the chosen area. Otherwise, as Vogel has pointed out, the land north will be on the west, the land south on the east, and so forth. Making this shift in directions creates its own set of problems, however, because in such a Nephite directional system, the sun would come up in the south and set in the north. These are serious considerations. How could Nephites possibly think that the sun would come up in the south and set in the north? They couldn't. Yet we have a geographic correlation that fits both the real-world geography and cultural history remarkably well, except when we come to the terms north, south, east, and west. I propose that if Mesoamerica is a good fit for the Book of Mormon, that we can use Mesoamerica to re-examine the nature of that fit. In short, an understanding of the Mesoamerican directional system offers an explanation for the way that the Book of Mormon directions correspond to that geography without a recourse to an artificial shift in the directions. Scholars have found very similar directional system among the various Mesoamerican cultures. Much of the data come from the Maya cultures because the ability to translate the carved and painted text provides a unique view of the pre-contact culture currently unavailable for any other Mesoamerican people. Nevertheless, what may be carefully worked out among the Maya data have sufficient corroboration and data from other cultures to allow an essentially pan-Mesoamerican orientation system. The Mesoamerican system is not a replica of our Western understanding of cardinal directions, even though it is often described using Western directional terms. While both systems are used to describe the real world and share some base characteristics, there is an incomplete overlap in meaning between the two systems. That incomplete overlap in meaning is too often hidden when we use the terms of the Western system of cardinal directions to describe the Mesoamerican system. Unlike the 4 cardinal directions, the Mesoamerican system had 5 directions. 4 have similarities to our north, south, east, and west, but the 5th direction was the center, which has no Western counterpart. But it was nevertheless a very important part of Mesoamerican method of orientation in the world. David Friedel, professor of archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis, and Linda Sheely, professor of art at the University of Texas, described this concept for the Maya. Just as the Maya gods marked the periphery by placing the 4 sides and corners around the center, the Maya shaman creates a 5-part image to sanctify space and open a portal to the other world. Mayanists have adopted the Latin word quincunx for this 5-point concept, although the Maya have many ways of expressing it in their own languages. The discerning of the 4 sides, or the 4 corners, and the establishing of their position relative to the center point is what we mean by centering. The Yucatec farmers today center their fields ritually even before they begin to cut them out of the fallow brushland. They mark off their fields and the units within them with small piles of stone, just as villages mark off their lands from those of neighboring communities with large piles of stone. For Westerners, the very idea of a direction almost implies movement. Our system tells us where we are headed. The Mesoamerican system helped people define where they were. From small to large, or large to small, Mesoamerican peoples centered themselves, their homes, and their cities at the crossroads of the world. Mary Miller, professor of history of art at Yale, and Carl Taube, associate professor of the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Riverside, described the way that the 5-part concept influenced multiple levels of the Mesoamerican world. One of the underlying organizational principles of Mesoamerican religion is replication, in which essential patterns of everyday life and surrounding world were copied and incorporated as models of religious thought and action. Basic features of the social world are often repeated on an increasingly larger scale to encompass the world and the workings of the universe. For example, in the Maya region, the house with its 4 walls and corner posts could stand for a maize field, the community, and the structure of the cosmos. Grand and abstract concepts are placed in human terms, and conversely, the ordered structure of the universe serves to sanctify and validate human social conventions. There was no universal center. Each city was its own world, its own center. Each family home replicated the world and placed that family at its center. Not only does the center direction differ from our Western understanding, even the Mesoamerican directions that roughly correspond to our north, south, east, and west are differently conceived. Susan Milbrath, affiliate professor of anthropology at the University of Florida, describes the Mesoamerican mode of orientation using a Maya community as her example. Analysis of Chamula astronomical concepts indicates that the primary axis is an east-west direction based on the sun's daily path. Even though they recognize that the zenith position is overhead, east is visualized as up direction and west as down. A universal aspect of Mesoamerican directional systems is that they are based on the path of the sun. They encode that path throughout the year, tracing the shifting rising and setting of the sun from solstice to solstice. Western cardinal directions are conceptually a plus sign, with each direction directly and cleanly associated with the pure direction equidistant from all other directions. The Mesoamerican system, on the other hand, is better represented in the form of an X. East is not a line toward the sun at the equinox, but the entire wedge created by tracing the passage of the sun along the horizon from solstice to solstice from the center. Archaeologist Prudence M. Rice puts it clearly. The Maya quadripartite, get that, knock it over. The Maya quadripartite organization of horizontal space is not strictly based on the 4 fixed cardinal directions recognized in the modern world. Instead, the divisions seem to invoke the solstice equinox positions and movements of the sun as it rises on the eastern horizon and sets in the western. Although the plausible origin of this conception is the travel of the sun along the horizon, Mesoamerican systems regularized their depictions and therefore their perceptions into a quadripartite system surrounding the center. The world was depicted as a square with lines drawn from the center and to each of the corners. The Codex Mendoza shows the Aztec capital at the center of the world. That's the graphic on the left, the one on the right being the artist's depiction of what that would have looked like. Tenochtitlan, indicated by the eagle and the cactus, the symbol of Tenochtitlan, sits at the center of the crossed lines that extend from each corner of the cosmos to the opposite corner. While the 5-part conception defined the understanding of one's orientation in the cosmos, the actual directional system appears to have been built on only a single direction, which was the path of the sun throughout the day and throughout the year. Other spatial relationships were made according to that defined axis. Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard University, provides some interesting background on this terminological problem. His emphasis was on understanding how the brain encodes meaning rather than anything to do with geography, but the example is informative. A set of studies by the anthropologist Stephen Levinson and his colleagues aim to show that a language's spatial terms determine how its speakers use the 3 dimensions of space to remember the locations of objects. Levinson's group examined Tzeltal, a language spoken in the Chiapas region of Mexico. Tzeltal has no general words for left or right. The closest it has are terms for left or right arm or leg, but the terms are rarely used for the left side of an object, table, or room. Instead, the Tzeltal describes spatial relationships or spatial arrangements relative to the mountain slope that dominates their village. The spatial vocabulary of Tzeltal includes words that mean up the slope, which is roughly southward, down the slope, roughly northward, and across the slope. These coordinates are not used just when traipsing up and down the mountain, but also when on flat terrain or indoors, and even when describing the arrangements of small objects. According to Levinson, Tzeltal speakers say, the spoon is downslope of the teacup, not the spoon is on the right of the teacup. We should not assume that Tzeltal speakers don't understand right and left. They certainly do. They simply use different terminology to describe those spatial relationships. What Pinker didn't know was that the upslope, downslope spatial orientation was repeated in their concept of world directions. Upslope, downslope are not only the terms that the Tzeltal use for left-right, but are also used instead of south and north. The Tzeltal conceive of the east-west axis as the critical direction for orientation. Upslope, left and south, and downslope, right and north, are simply the same terms that they would use for anything else that is spatially oriented against the main reference, the sun in the case of the directions, or the human body in the case of the location of the spoon and the cup. They are not terms for north and south, but simply for spatial orientation against a central position. David Stewart of the Peabody Museum at Harvard University analyzed 2 Maya glyphs and argued for their meaning as right and left by noting their visual associations with other glyphs typically given as south and north. He concludes, as students of Maya cosmology have often noted, the sun's path defines the principal axis of the universe with its right and left, determining the perpendicular axis that corresponds to our north and south. In Chamula and other Maya communities, the celestial sides are perceived from the sun's own perspective. The idea is corroborated by a larger study of direction terms in various Mesoamerican languages. Nicholas A. Hopkins, visiting instructor at the Centro de Estudios Mayas at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and J. Catherine Josserand, research associate, Pre-Columbian Art Research Institute, found a general agreement in vocabulary for east and west that was related to the path of the sun. They note, terms for north and south are much more elusive. First, there are far fewer reports for these terms. Second, there are no consistent patterns in the nomenclature. Many languages have no recorded terms for north and south, even when east and west are noted. They conclude, the extreme chaos of the terms for north and south reinforces the idea that these directions are almost irrelevant. Directional orientation is based on the movement of the sun east to west, and the other two directions are of lesser importance. How then do we derive a system of 4 directions that is recorded in the village barrios, regional states, and other matters? The solution seems to be, as Karen Bassi has argued, that east and west are not directions at all, but broad quadrants of the sky centered on, but not limited to, the cardinal directions east and west. East is the entire section of the horizon where the sun rises during the year, from solstice to solstice and back again. This quadrant is represented in site layout by the E-group complexes found at Huacatún and elsewhere. West is the corresponding quadrant where the sun is observed to set. North and south are simply the quadrants that lie between these two, that lie at the sides of the sky, to the right hand or to the left. That is, 2 defined quadrants simply imply 2 others, giving a total of 4. The 4 corners of the Maya world are simply the limits of the east-west quadrants and do not imply 4 cardinal directions. Hopkins and Josserand report an interesting example of what happened when an informant was asked to give a word for north. A Tocholabal speaker, a Maya language, did not provide a word, but rather a definition. And I've actually got the Tocholabal here, but since Mark would be the only one laughing at me when I tried to pronounce it, I'll skip that part for you. The translation is, we are looking north when we stand with our left hand toward where the sun goes down. So when he was asked for a word for north, that's what he came up with. There was no north in the Mesoamerican system, only a spatial relationship to that side of the sun's path. That is why the vocabulary varies so greatly. It wasn't that Mesoamericans didn't know where north was. They conceived it entirely differently. It existed only as a quadrant on the left or the right of the sun's path, where some Mesoamerican cultures called it right and some left. It is both interesting and important to note that Mesoamericans were not the only peoples to use left-right rather than specific names for directions. William J. Hamlin, professor of history at Brigham Young University, notes, the Hebrews, like most Semitic peoples, oriented themselves by facing east toward the rising sun. Thus, east in Hebrew was simply front, with south as right, north as left, and west as rear, or sea. The Egyptians oriented themselves by facing south toward the source of the Nile. One of the terms for south in Egyptian is also a term for face. The usual word for north is probably related to a word that means back of the head, and the word for east is the same as left, and west is the word for right. One need not assume any linguistic connection between Middle Eastern and Mesoamerican languages to account for the similarities. Using the body as a directional model from an accepted focal point is easily seen as an independent invention. So where do we go with that in the Book of Mormon? It is worth explaining that our Book of Mormon is the result of Joseph Smith's translation. The nature of that translation has been the subject of discussion among faithful scholars, with opinions ranging from Brigham H. Roberts' declaration that Joseph had to give an expression of those facts and ideas in such language as he could command, to Royal Skousen's understanding that Joseph Smith precisely read a translation that had already been done and which appeared in some manner on the interpreters. My own analysis of the available data is more in line with Roberts. And Royal and I talked yesterday, and we realized we haven't talked about this yet. We ought to. In the case of the Book of Mormon directions, I suggest that Joseph used common vocabulary to express the Book of Mormon's system of spatial orientation, and that the perception of cardinal directions in the text is the result of the translation rather than the plate text. I also suggest that there are sufficient hints to allow us to reconstruct that plate text system from the traces remaining in Joseph's translation. In the case of Book of Mormon directions, I suggest that Joseph used, let's see, I get the right paragraph here. Although we certainly find the words north, south, east, and west in the Book of Mormon, there is an important and very specific phrase that I believe replicates the essential Mesoamerican direction system. From the east to the west. That's the phrase, from the east to the west. Against the background of Mesoamerican directions, it is a reasonable initial hypothesis that this phrase represents plate text terms that indicated the path of the sun. This phrase, implying solar movements, occurs 10 times. There is a single occurrence of from the west to the east in 3 Nephi 1:17, and a single related from the sea east to the sea west in Helaman 3:8. Importantly, both of these reversals of solar directions come in the context of an expansion of the meaning of the whole earth. Didn't I put one of those on? I did. And they began to know that the Son of God must shortly appear, yea, and find all the people upon the face of the whole earth from the west to the east, both in the land north and in the land south, were so exceedingly astonished that they fell to earth. And then the next one, and it came to pass that they did multiply and spread, did go forth upon the land southward to the land northward, and they spread insomuch that they began to cover the face of the whole earth, from the sea south to the sea north, from the sea west to the sea east. Although the from to construction implies movement, the cases of from the west to the east do not come in connection with any movement, but rather with descriptions of the face of the whole earth. With only 2 examples, it's a weak hypothesis, but I suggest that there was a literary reversal used in describing whole earth. I believe that by reversing the known path of the sun, it placed the face of the whole earth firmly in metaphorical rather than the physical realm. In contrast to the movement implied when using the phrase from the east to the west, the common usage for the other 2 directions is on the north and on the south. There are no instances of from the north to the south or from to the south to the north, not even in verses describing the whole earth. For example, Alma 46:17, and it came to pass that when he had poured out his soul to God, he named all the land which was south of the land desolation, yea, and fine, all the land, both on the north and on the south, a chosen land, a land of liberty. Where the Mesoamerican cultures used terms such as on the right, on the left, or some other spatial indicator, such as upslope, downslope with the Tzaltal, the Book of Mormon translation supplies the words north and south. Although the specific word comes from Joseph's Western translations, the words are couched in phrases that replicate the functional relationships of the Mesoamerican system. The Book of Mormon vocabulary of spatial orientation also replicates the 4 quarters assigned to the east, west, and the sides of the sky known as the north and the south. In Mosiah 27:6 we find, And there began to be much peace again in the land, and the people began to be very numerous, and began to scatter abroad upon the face of the earth, yea, on the north, and on the south, and on the east, and on the west, building large cities and villages in all quarters of the land. Of course, this is not definitively a translation from the plate text, because we also find quarters of the land in the Bible, and it's always possible that the term was borrowed from biblical usage. Nevertheless, it fits with the entire system, even if it can't be probatory of the source of the concept. This conception of the Nephite usage of directional terms helps us explain a passage that would be otherwise difficult. The flight of the Lamanite Amalekite army is described in Alma 2, 35 to 37. And it came to pass, when they had all crossed the river Sidon, that the Lamanites and the Amalekites began to flee before them, notwithstanding that they were so numerous that they could not be numbered. And they fled before the Nephites toward the wilderness, which was west and north, away beyond the borders of the land. And the Nephites did pursue them with all their might, and did slay them. Yea, they were met on every hand, and slain and driven, until they were scattered on the west and on the north, until they had reached the wilderness, which was called Hermounts, and it was that part of the wilderness which was infested by wild and ravenous beasts. In this description, a fleeing army heads both west and north. Because we see northward with some frequency in the Book of Mormon, it could have been used to indicate travel to the northwest. Instead, the text opts for travel both north and west. This is conceptually difficult in the plus-style cardinal directions, but quite understandable if the X-style quadrants are meant. In that case, they would simply wander back and forth over the conceptual line dividing the west quarter from the north quarter. Just as with the description given by the Tocholabal speaker, if one were to stand with their left hand to the sun's setting during the summer solstice, one would be looking north, and that north corresponds quite nicely to the north Sorenson suggested. No skewing of 60 degrees to the west is required. However, it should be noted that it would be a misrepresentation of Nephite directions to use north and south to indicate only the direction based on the summer solstice. For Nephites, north would have included anything to that side of the sun's path. An inherent misperception of any ancient directional system simply occurs by our attempts to represent them on a map. Our map takes a bird's eye view, and often literally a satellite's view, of the land we're interested in. Almost any map that we use to describe Book of Mormon geography assumes an understanding of an area of land larger than the ancients would have comprehended. Their world was limited to what they could see, travel to, or have described to them. No remaining map created by any Mesoamerican people has any of the details of our modern maps. They are spatially inaccurate and locate landmarks without precise distances or interrelationships. The maps place the reader at the center and describe the conceptual bounds of the world in distances that might be a day or two travel. Combined with the differences in terminology and cultural perceptions, it's little wonder that the Book of Mormon directions appear difficult to fit onto a modern map. That inherent difficulty becomes even greater when we insist upon reading literal geographic statements where the text does not intend a literal reading. That's the issue that clouds our understanding of Nephite seas. So now the question is, where was the Nephite sea east and the sea west? Another possible contraindication for Sorenson's geographic correlation is the relationship of that geography to the surrounding seas. Helaman 3:8 clearly mentions 4 seas. And it came to pass that they did multiply and spread, and did go forth from the land southward to the land northward, and did spread insomuch that they began to cover the whole face of the earth, from the sea south to the sea north, and from the sea west to the sea east. Some Book of Mormon geographers therefore insist on finding 4 surrounding bodies of water. However, John E. Clark notes, of these seas, I am convinced that the reference to a North Sea and a South Sea is devoid of any concrete geographical content. All specific references or allusions to Book of Mormon seas are only to the East and West Seas. Any geography that tries to accommodate a North and South Sea, I think, is doomed to fail. But we cannot dismiss the reference of these seas out of hand. If they are metaphorical, what was the metaphor? And this figure that I've got up here shows a conceptualization of Nephite lands. And by the way, I'm still quoting John Clark. The city of Zarahemla and the lands immediately surrounding it were the center in Helaman 1:24-27, or the heart, elements 60 and 19, Helaman 1 and 18, of the land. The surrounding lands to the various wildernesses were considered quarters of the land. A bountiful quarter and a Manti quarter are mentioned. Moroni was another part of the land. We lack information on the eastern quarter. My designation of Melech is simply my best guess. We have seen that the Nephite lands were surrounded by wilderness on every side, and conceptually by each wilderness, or beyond each wilderness, lay a sea to the south, north, west, and east. Thus the land was conceived of surrounded by seas, or floating on one large sea. The land was divided into a center and 4 quarters. Each quarter duplicated the others. The quartering of the land was not the way most of us would do it, by making a cross following the cardinal directions, but was a cross shown in this figure. Such a conception of the world would not be out of place in the Middle East at the time of Lehi. It was remarkably close to the Mesoamerican view of their world. The main point is that the reference to the North and South Seas fit nicely into the Mesoamerican scene as part of the metaphor for the whole earth, and was probably used in a metaphorical sense in the Book of Mormon. Clark's proposal that the North and South Seas are metaphorical rather than physical finds an interesting parallel in the metaphorical use of the phrase, the other side of the sea, in various Maya documents. Frauke Sachse of the University of Bonn and Alan J. Christensen of Brigham Young University note that it is a metaphor that, quote, remains hitherto largely unrecognized because a presumed literalness has obstructed its metaphorical interpretation. They conclude by noting the phrase, the other side of the sea in colonial sources, is only a metaphor for the place of origin in the sense of creation and not departure, and thus does not necessarily refer to any actual location that could be found on a map. It is perhaps not coincidental that the metaphorical meaning that Clark suggests for sea north and sea south is also associated with the conceptual organization of the world. As Hopkins and Josrand worked through the vocabulary terms used for East and West, they presented their reconstruction of the Maya classic terms that might have been, for what the Maya classic terms might have been. The East and the West, they reconstructed both of the words with plausible meanings. One of them is with the meaning the front porch of the house of the sun, or where the sun exists, and the other, the door of the house of the sun, or where the sun enters. And they argue that these proto-forms may be traced back to as early as 2000 BC. In a world conceptually surrounded by seas, the house of the sun would lie across the sea or on the other side of the sea. Thus, Sachse and Christensen explain, we understand that in the Maya worldview, all creation involves an underlying concept of birth from a primordial sea in darkness. The world came into being because the earth and the mountains arose from the sea and the sky and were lifted up from the water. Creation thus involves dawning. The other side of the sea refers metaphorically to an origin in the conceptual East Sea, the place of dawning and creation. Thus, there was a very strong cultural preference for having a sea east and a parallel sea west. The question is how that conceptual world might have related to the physical seas that the Book of Mormon text requires. In spite of the metaphorical meanings for sea north and sea south and the metaphorical meaning associated with the East Sea, the Book of Mormon text does support the physical presence of a sea east. Sorenson's correlation has the expected sea east, but applies that term to the Gulf of Mexico, which is north of the land surrounding the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. How can this body of water in the north be the sea east? In Sorensen's correlation, this is part of the skewing of the directions. I again suggest that no skewing is necessary, only the application of the principles of the Mesoamerican directions. The first important part of the explanation is that the Mesoamerican concept of the center. Any directions given in the Book of Mormon necessarily relate to some location that is conceptually the center. Directions related to a different center might result in different directions being placed in the directional quadrants. And we can see the same principle even in our own modern directional system. We may describe Denver as being in the east when we're located in Salt Lake City, but in the west when we're located in St. Louis. What is east or west depends upon the vantage point from which we view the direction. I propose that sea east is a description rather than a name, and that two different bodies of water might have been considered sea east based upon the different center points from which they are described. The original Nephite center point was not Zarahemla, but rather the city of Nephi. In Sorensen's correlation, we have the highland valley of Guatemala as a plausible land for Nephi. From that center, the East Sea would be on the right, where several Book of Mormon geographers suggest, off the coast of modern Belize. From that original center point, the Nephites would then have the option of calling the Pacific either the Sea West or the Sea South, since it creates a coastline that would be both south and west of the land of Nephi. Because the definition of the Mesoamerican directional system has the sun setting in the Sea West, it's logical they would have selected that designation for what we know as the Pacific Ocean. The interesting combination of the Sea West being both west and south helps explain Alma 53 and 22. And now it came to pass that Helaman did march at the head of his 2,000 stripling soldiers to the support of the people in the borders of the land on the south by the Sea West. The land of south of Zarahemla bordered the West Sea, not a South Sea, or even when there was a coastline on the south. While there is a reference to a sea east from the land of Nephi, most references to the sea east come from the time when the directions were given in relationship to the city of Bountiful, not the city of Nephi or even the city of Zarahemla. Using Sorensen's correlation, Bountiful would be located on the northern side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. With that location as the center point, the Gulf of Mexico lies both on the north and on the east. Just as the cultural necessity of the sun rising from across the sea east and setting in the sea west allowed the Nephites to define a sea west from the center point of city of Nephi, that same cultural preference would naturally select sea east and allow sea east when the center point is Bountiful. No skewing of directions is necessary to see the Gulf of Mexico as the sea east based on the perception of Bountiful as the center. Regardless of the body of the water, the sea east existed as a description that was related to the cosmological understanding of the east as a place of creation and the rising birth of the sun. In the Book of Mormon, it's plausible that two different bodies of water served that function and were designated, not named, sea east to conform to that cosmological principle. There's another feature of the Book of Mormon that may be plausibly related to an underlying Mesoamerican direction system. The vast majority of the times we see the word northward or southward in the Book of Mormon, they are descriptive of a place, not movement. They refer to the land northward and the land southward. The term northward only appears 3 times as a description of motion, and southward only twice. Eastward occurs 3 times as an indication of a direction of travel, and westward does not occur at all. The phrases land northward and land southward can parallel the functions of north-south spatial orientation markers, but they are distinct from them. We find in 3 Nephi 6:2, and it came to pass that they had not eaten up their provisions, therefore they did take with them all that they had not devoured, of every grain of their kind, their gold, their silver, and all their possessions and things they did return to their own lands and their possessions, both on the north and on the south, both on the land northward and on the land southward. There is no reason to indicate the spatial orientation twice. The reference here clearly separates the land from the spatial orientation. The two lands conceptually meet on a dividing line. Thus, the land on the northward was called Desolation, and the land on the southward was called Bountiful, it being a wilderness which was filled with all manner of wild animals of every kind, a part of which had come from the land northward for food. And that's Alma 22 and 31. When the land northward has a name, it is Desolation. When the land southward has a name, it is Bountiful. They are adjacent lands. Land northward and Desolation are interchangeable terms. Land southward and land Bountiful are interchangeable terms. The obvious conceptual inversion of Desolation Bountiful suggests that there is another aspect of the Mesoamerican system at play. Prudence M. Rice indicates that each of the four conceptual directions had other attributes. Among the lowland Maya, the solar basis for naming directions is evidenced by incorporating sun into the term. So east, Lakin, is associated with sunrise, birth, and the color red, while west was associated with sunset, death, and the color black. By contrast, north was associated with up, as in the sun at the zenith, and the sun god's right on his side of the journey, heavens, the number 13, the place of the ancestors, and the color white. South was associated with down, of the sun's nadir, the sun's left, the underworld, the number 9, night, and the sun on its underworld journey back to the east, and the color yellow. Although the associations with north and right is common, it was not universal. David Stewart indicates, the south glyph was widely thought to read Nohol, the word for south in the Yucatecan language, attested in Chontal and Cholti. The low suffix on the south glyph written in Nachdunik cave offers good support for this reading. The term is Noh, which has the meaning of large, great, principal, or right side. The Noh reading seems to be fitting with the name land, terms on Tikal's Marcador. The first glyph of the pair would read Nohkab, a widespread and familiar term in Maya languages for the right hand. So you can get a reversal. In the case Stewart describes, the orientation that leads to the terms for north and south is based on facing the sun rather from the perspective of the sun. It appears that there were two possible methods for deriving the term for north or south, both based on the same principle, but from either facing the sun or from the sun's perspective. In that light, Hopkins and Joshua note the data for the later Mexica, who were Nahuatl speakers. While classical Nahuatl has a mythological reference to a place of death as the base of north, one variety of modern Nahuatl makes an association of south, for which no term is recorded as sinister, left-handed, and regards north as positive and right-handed, while calling it downslope. As with the data for the Mayan languages, the Nahuatl languages also demonstrate this reversal of handedness for north and south. There are strong indications that there were similar bad-good perception about left and right, and therefore north-south was shared those terms among the classic Maya as there was in classical Nahuatl. Maya epigraphers Stephen Houston, David Stewart, and Carl Taube note, consistently the right hand is straight, correct, large, or fine and pure, or decorated, adorned in Quiche, while the left hand is not quite obedient, and thus in colonial Yucatec, ill-behaved, graceless, or clumsy like a cloven hoof, and in Quiche, crazy hand. In a spatial relation system that uses right-left hand designations for terms we call south and north, it is not surprising at all that the Nephites used a term for left-hand north that would have had a pejorative connotation. That the land northward was also associated with a dead Jaredite culture simply vindicated the pejorative association. This gives a very simple explanation for why the land northward is desolation and the land southward is bountiful. The labels replicate the cultural perception of the spatial relationships based on facing the rising sun and indicate that the Nephite preference was to associate the left or north, similar to the Maya languages of Yucatec, Chontal, and Cholti. The most serious contraindication for John Sorenson's correlation between Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon has been the shifting of north some 60 degrees to the west. The quality of the correlations with the rest of the geography and cultural data suggests that we look to Mesoamerica to see if the cultural data from that region in which the Book of Mormon took place, according to this correlation, might provide an understanding of what has come to be known as Nephite North, although it's not a term that Sorenson uses. The combination of Mesoamerican center and the perception of the quadrants as wedges emanating from that center explain how the Book of Mormon North might include a region that our cultural predisposition for cardinal directions would not recognize. Combined with the shifting center points from which directions or spatial relationships may be discussed, we have a culturally appropriate understanding of the underlying plate text directions that yielded the English translations of north, south, east, and west. In addition to explaining the spatial terms, it also provides a cultural underpinning for why the land northward was desolation and the land southward bountiful. Sorensen's geographic correlation not only remains the best supported, but what has been a directional conundrum actually provides further indication that the plate text was written in a region steeped in Mesoamerican understanding of spatial orientation. Thank you. That's the next test, okay. Wouldn't the earthquakes at the time of Christ, that Christ came to America, change the geography so drastically that assumptions of correlation become less sure? Here's my standard answer to that one. How many of you are familiar with Mount St. Helens erupting? Kind of heard about that? The face of Mount St. Helens has changed dramatically. It's still in the same place. There isn't anybody in the state of Washington or Oregon that is confused about where Mount St. Helens might currently be or whether or not it's related to what was there before. Nevertheless, it is significantly different. And I think when you look at any kind of geological process that occurs on the Earth, we certainly get things that change, but not so dramatically that we cannot relate what was there before to what came after. So certain things are certainly going to be different, but not to the point where we'll never be able to figure out what was there. If I wanted to know how I would travel to Salt Lake City from the center of Sandy, what would a Maya tell me? Depending on which version of it, Salt Lake would be on the north or on the right. So you would travel on the north. Yeah, well, yes, ours. Yeah, on the right. There we go. That's the problem with translations. We can't get away from it. We're so stuck with north, south, east, and west that we have a real hard time backing out of that system and trying to understand how somebody else understood the world. A friend of mine just came back from his mission in the Philippines, and he was talking about one of the problems they have with some of the missionaries who were sent there to figure out where ward boundaries were because nobody really knew. And so they're trying to map out ward boundaries, and they're explaining to these native Filipinos, we have to locate these things on a map, and they have no concept of a map. And they're showing them the map of Manila, where they can drive anywhere they want, but they look at the map and it's foreign to them. They have no clue what that map meant. And they had to say, pretend you're a bird flying over. And that finally gave them the concept of a map. It just wasn't understandable to them. And that's one of the problems that we have, again, looking at the Book of Mormon. We assume that everybody in the ancient world had the kind of maps that we do and have the perspective that we do. And they simply did not. Let's see, I wonder if you need all this explanation and justification if you assume that the Book of Mormon geography is in America rather than Mesoamerica. You can certainly do pretty well with north, south, east, and west if you make that assumption. The problem is now you've got other problems. For example, you have the Mississippi that's flowing south instead of north, and the text is pretty obvious when you look at elevations that the source of the Sidon is going to have to be in the south. And no matter what happened at the time of Christ, I really doubt that it changed the way rivers flow. They go downhill. So there are other kinds of issues. When you take everything together, Mesoamerica ends up be a better correlation. So you might do better on north, south, east, and west, but you got lots of other problems you have to deal with. Let's see, how does the use of directional language in the Book of Mormon compare with the use of directional language in the Old Testament? Would not the Jewish descendants of Lehi have carried with them their Jewish expressions of direction? As Hamlin noticed, some of that is very similar. The next question is, would they have carried with them their Hebrew assumptions? That's a point of debate. It's one where I don't think there's anybody that really agrees on that, and you'll find that I'm probably on the minority side of that one. I think that very soon after the Lehites arrived in the New World, they were mixing with other populations, and as the minority language, if they were going to survive, they had to figure out what everybody else's language was. I am sure that they were able to retain Hebrew because they could read it a long time later. So I think it became a scholarly language. But most of the people in Rome no longer speak Latin, even though there's a lot of Latin written. And I think that's kind of what was happening. If I faced east, is it correct to say I'm going up to BYU or I'm going down to BYU? Depends on whether you're a U of U fan. In Maya cosmology, is there a conception of movement of the sun underworld from the west to the east? Yeah, in the night it's coming back around. So conceptually, it's making the arc coming around. Might this explain the usage and context of the whole earth? It certainly is part of that. 3 Nephi 1:17, Helaman 3:8, both use the expression from the west to the east in the context of references to the land north and the land south. Does this suggest that the four terms refer to the cardinal directions? And again, that's the problem. What does north and south really mean? And the question then you have to take is, what do you do with the word? Does every word that's in the Book of Mormon mean exactly what I think that word should mean in English, or was it translated from an ancient language where there might be some difference? And lots of people are going to have differences of opinion on that. Mine is that there was an authentic ancient text that was translated to English, and there were times when the terminological mapping of what our words are to what their words didn't have that exact correlation. And that's where I think if you go back through the text and the rest of the information, that's where you find that remnant of the plate text system that looks different in English, because again, we have such a hard time getting that out of our head. How does Nephi's directions of south-southeast direction fit with this understanding? This is giving 1 Nephi 16:13. Clearly when Nephi is giving this and he's writing it in his own hand and speaking about what they're doing in the old world, that's an old world direction, and it's going to refer to Hebrew and directions in the old world. That doesn't mean that that's going to describe what the world is going to look like to somebody who is probably speaking a different language, is certainly in a different world 600 years later. So things are going to be changing. The fact that it looks one way when Nephi is talking about the old world and it looks slightly different when they get to the new world is just part of the nature of how things change over time, and particularly in context of other cultures. That they considered themselves to be on an isle of the sea in relationship to those. That's a metaphor again. The isle of the sea, at least in the old world concept, was simply anything with a coast. And Nephi knew that they were on a coast. The Isle of the Sea designation is one that Nephi uses a lot, and uses it because of Isaiah. And he ties it into his conception of what they're doing and their restoration to the house of Israel, and then it fades. It's never really used as directional terms in the Book of Mormon. So Isle of the Sea is a theological concept in Nephi that fades after he's gone. Let's see, when describing movements of either Nephite or Lamanite armies, the Book of Mormon seems to be quite precise. If we follow your thesis, how would the armies have known where the precise movements? Well, the same way the Mesoamericans did. Everybody knew where everybody was. You know if you're on the right hand or the left hand. The fact that you have a different direction doesn't mean you don't know where something is. Just like the Tzeltal, who says that the spoon's on the downslope of the cup. Well, we would say right, they say downslope. Where is the spoon? It's in the same physical place. We just use different words to describe it. Nobody is saying, boy, I can't figure out what that darn spoon is because I can't remember the word. It doesn't happen. We know where we are. We know how to describe it based on the languages we have. All right.
Next, we're going to shift from the Book of Mormon to the Book of Abraham, but you have a 5-minute break.